Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another webinar organized by UN Digital, Youth News and Digital Citizenship Project. It's the first webinar in English. We are very exciting. Today, we are welcoming Denise, a researcher from the University of Groningen, who we would like to thank you once again for accepting our invitation. Denise is a doctoral student and a researcher at the Researcher Center for Media and Journalism Studies at the University of Groningen. Her research centers um, her research centers on the digital literacy of children and young people was a prerequisite for an inclusive society. Today, Denise will be presenting a communication called Playful Citizens, exploring children's news use in formal and informal contexts. Thank you, Denise, once again. The floor is yours.
Yes, before I share my screen, I want to thank you all. Thank you for inviting me, first of all, but also thank you for everyone for being here. I'm very excited to discuss this part of my research. As Margarita said, my research is quite broadly about digital literacy, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit. But one of the aspects that we found was children having conversations and playfully engaging with news. And that was actually such a surprising finding, and I'm very happy to share this part of my thesis with you all. And then let me share the screen. We've practiced this, so I think it will go fine. Let's see.
We can see it, Denise. Is everything
Perfect. That went so smoothly. Yes, so indeed, my presentation is called Playful Citizens, Exploring Children's News Use in Formal and Informal Contexts. And what that means, I'll discuss in a little bit. But first of all, it's good to introduce myself. I'm Denise Mansonides, and indeed, I am currently a PhD candidate at the University of Groningen. I'm in the final stages of my PhD, so currently writing a lot. And within the university and within the Center for Media and Journalism Studies, I'm also a part of the Digital Inclusion Lab, which I will be talking a little bit more about in a bit. But first for today, I will be talking about our broader project, so about the Digital Inclusion Lab, but also about my PhD project as a whole for a little bit, just to give a little bit of context. And then we will focus on this part of the PhD thesis surrounding children's news use. I'll talk a bit about methodology. I know that there are some people here in the crowd who know that I am big on methodology and I'm very interested in methodology. So I want to spend a little bit more attention to that as well. And then we'll go into findings and eventually have the conclusion, questions, and anything else. So please, I welcome all comments, all feedback, all ideas. So yes, let me know. And if you have a question in between, also feel free to ask me that. Yes, so the Digital Inclusion Lab started a little while ago, and currently there is 5 projects within it. And my project called Digital Literacy in the Context of the Family, you see on the bottom left. But my colleagues also look at digital literacy in public libraries and the courses that people get there. There are some various pilots currently running. My other PhD colleague is in the same project right now, but he is trying to understand how low literate citizens, so typically adult citizens, deal with digital inclusion and digital literacy. And very soon a new project called Included will start. So we're all very excited about that because all these projects together, we try to understand how digital literacy is learned, applied, and experienced, and translated within everyday digital practices. And you will hear that more often we take a very user-centered perspective, so try to understand what do people and citizens and children and adults and older people actually do with media, and how can we support these processes in which they are already engaging. And why are we doing this? To explore and understand questions surrounding the inclusion of different groups of people in an increasingly digital society. That's a lot of words. I think first it's important to understand why this is so important in the context of the Netherlands, because we are doing research within the Netherlands primarily. And I have some numbers for that. So as we all know, digital media have become increasingly central to people's everyday lives, from evaluating news and information to communicating with the government, applying for benefits or healthcare. Knowing how to deal with digital technologies is pivotal for citizens to be included and participate in contemporary society. However, research shows that a large part of the Dutch adults run the risk of being excluded. So 42%, and that translates to up to 5 million Dutch people, Dutch adults, lack the basic digital skills to perform tasks, with citizens of lower socioeconomic status being overrepresented in that share. And then I always ask people, do you think that number gets better when we try to understand how younger people in the Netherlands deal with digital media? And normally people say yes. And I do think that technical skills, indeed, younger people have some advantage into that. But when you look at still essential digital skills and essential media literacy skills, 64% of young people lack these skills. So they are likely to persist among the generation of the so-called digital natives. And this age is very important because it indicates that children have not developed these skills before they are turning 13 to 18 years old. So before they reach this teen stage. And that age group is very interesting for us, 8 to 12, because this is such a formative period where children develop digital skills and develop habits that sustain for the rest of their lives, which is also why we're focusing on this age group in my current PhD project, which asks the question if and how the causes that foster or prohibit the development of digital literacy differ between children with a more or less socioeconomic background. So here we see again that factor of socioeconomic background coming into the project. We did this by focusing on the social context of the after-school care. And this is a really interesting social context because it kind of combines two other contexts, namely those of the home, the very informal social context, and that of the school, which is a more formal, structured context. And this third space, as we call it, serves as an intermediary between the educational environment and the domestic sphere. So in the after-school care, children autonomously establish the course of activities, whatever they want to do, and they can pursue their own interest at a self-determined pace while engaging in social interactions with their peers, which is also a really interesting aspect for us. How are they using digital media in relation to the peers in their lives? So this was the focus, and we included four different after-school care locations in the city of Groningen. That's a city in the northern part of the Netherlands, and then the after-school care locations were located in four different neighborhoods. One in a neighborhood with typical high socioeconomic residents, two in mixed regions, and then one in a neighborhood where citizens generally had a lower socioeconomic status. And I observed at these locations 2 times a week, did participant observations for over 3 years. So it was a very long project. And it was so important to see from the children's perspective what they were doing with media. And we combined this with interviews with the children themselves, but also with their parents and teachers. And very prevalent themes then were exploration, social connection, resilience, and citizenship, which is the theme that we'll go into in this presentation. Are there any questions about the broader project until now? I'm looking to the left, but that's my other screen. So if something comes up, I'll probably see it there. Yes, so let's go into what we've all come for today, children's playful explorations of news and citizenship. So after having visited the after-school care locations over the course of a year, we analyzed all field notes, leading us to distinguish the theme play and news-related practices, which is the theme that we'll be focusing on today. And to do that, I want to start with an excerpt from field notes that shows children's interest in news as well. And I think it's really important to start from this perspective. I did multiple presentations on children and news. And one time I was in the bus on my way to a presentation, and I got talking with the bus driver, and he was like, "What do you do for work?" And I explained that I was going to do a presentation about children and news, and he was so surprised. He's like, "Children and news? That's not a combination that I would have thought of. They find news so boring. Like, I don't know any kid who's interested in news." And I think that's the typical kind of view that people might have. So I think it's good to start with a little bit of the data that really nicely demonstrates the opposite. And then I hope to show throughout this webinar that children in their own way explore news and enact in acts of citizenship. So in this case, the boys are all standing around the childcare worker who is sitting at the table with an iPad. And when I join them, I see that they have the map of Russia and Ukraine on the iPad. And on the news, they've heard things about tensions between Russia and other countries. To illustrate, this is in January before the war started. And they've heard probably in school some things about it, but they don't know exactly what's going on. So they asked the childcare worker what it is about, and he explains it using the iPad. And he shows where the countries are, and he explains what is going on at the moment, and the children are quiet and listen attentively. So you immediately see this perspective that children can go after their own interest in this space. They had questions and they asked the childcare worker to discuss it with them. It's good to take a step back and go back to news use and news literacy. We are living in an increasingly difficult media landscape, and navigating news contact has become a very difficult task. I know for me, for the other adults in my environment, sometimes it's become quite difficult to find good, reliable news because you're overthrown with all these different types of information. So the concept of news literacy that was coined under the umbrella of media literacy education addresses these concerns by offering pathways that explore the possibilities and pitfalls created by the intersections of journalism, citizenship, and technology. And I use the concept here by Tully Maxwell et al., who argued that the definition of news literacy should include the fact that audiences need to continuously adapt to these changing media environments, so that it includes the knowledge of the personal and social processes by which news is produced, but also includes the skills that allow users some control over these different processes, with eventually the goal that the people who become news literate, who develop news literacy, will be able to use critical thinking to find and evaluate news sources, that would then be able to find their way in an ever-changing digital media landscape, and who can protect themselves from misinformation. But these concepts, they don't really apply one-to-one on children. So I think it's important to then ask the question, what type of role do children then play into this field? Starting with the common misconceptions, children find news boring, are uninterested, are not politically engaged, do not engage with news, when actually children engage with a range of different types of news content, starting from quite a young age, especially as they are increasingly independently using digital media devices. They are able to start learning about news-making processes at the age of 7. They still get most of their news from their parents. and that children's engagement with news is dependent on their social context. So it is important that we understand the context in which children engage with news. Which led us to the following research question for this study. How do news-related practices of children between the ages of 8 and 12 differ between formal and informal social contexts? And how do these practices raise opportunities for lived citizenship? So there are two different terms that I want to highlight here. First, news-related practices. I got that from Hobart's definition of media-related practices. And I conceptualize news-related practices as the ways in which children actively engage with news. So this encompasses how they come across it, how they respond to it, how they share it with others, how they participate in discussions about it, and the extent to which these practices are integrated in the context of their everyday lives. By taking this approach, we move away from very normative perspectives of news, of understanding that this is news and how do children engage with that, but really start from their own experiences with digital media and the multifaceted ways in which children navigate and interact with these different types of content, emphasizing their agency and involvement in the process. And then the other concept is the concept of lived citizenship, which I got from Lister. This citizenship concept is also less normative, less formal, less focused on formal political participation, but allows us to understand the ways in which children enact civic acts in their own context. So ways that are personally meaningful for them. For example, raising money for a cause of their choice by making bracelets, for example. If we look at how children have been included in previous research, we see that this body of work mainly focuses on children above the ages of 12, and is mainly focused on news literacy programs in formal social contexts, such as the school. However, because we know that news use is dependent on social context, we don't yet know if the skills that children actually build in the context of the school also translate to the informal context of the home, in which they are independently using media and come across different types of sources. If we look at previous research that has included younger children, this is mostly work that has explored harm that's caused by violent news content and the ways in which children respond to that type of content. So these approaches limitedly include the role of social actors also, besides parents, as well as children's own experiences with and surrounding news and other types of information. So we propose to study in this project children between the ages of 8 and 12, and having a focus on both these informal types of contexts, so the after-school care, and the formal type of social context of the school. This is a figure that I made for a different paper in which I demonstrate that how children use media is dependent on this social context, but is also supporting or hindering possibly the development of social processes in which they are already engaging. So currently, the presentation I'm doing it now is mostly centered around the middle, so the yellow line with citizenship. And then we see that there are different activities in the home, then in school, then in third spaces. So these different approaches to news may also invite different practices through which children engage with news, underscoring the importance of considering their news-related practices within both these contexts. I want to tell you a little bit more about these two distinct contexts. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of how these are structured in the Netherlands and how they were structured in my research. So the context of the after-school care, which was the informal social context, was characterized by a blend of both structured and unstructured activities. So children could either choose for something that was already prearranged, or they could do something that they wanted to play outside, make up their own games, draw, play board games. And this offered children opportunities for both social interaction, but also self-directed exploration in a supervised yet informal environment. So children could undertake activities of their choice, while digital media use was structured through various screen time rules. Also, opportunities for digital media use very much varied between different locations. As opposed to the context of the school, this consists of more structured activities, which mainly revolved around answering questions, teacher-guided structured conversations, and in terms of news, especially maintaining an overall sense of seriousness when it came to children's engagement with news. So for this project, we did participant observations at after-school care, which included 70 children in a total of 107 observations over 4 locations, and then participant observations at primary schools with 195 children, 48 observations and 5 locations, and in the end, interviews with 9 teachers across 5 locations. So in this figure, we'll go into detail because I think it's very small on your screen. So I'll highlight the things in the following slides. We found this disconnect basically in both news perception, the way children perceive news, what is news, but also in the way they were interested in news and how this led to the news-related practices in which they engaged. So for the findings, I want to go through them step by step, start with news perception, go up to news interest, and finally finish with news-related practices. And I want to start every section with a little excerpt because I think the data speaks for itself most of the time, and it's very interesting. So at location D, we were playing outside. I was sitting on a bench, and David, a very tough boy, he was already 11, so there's also some status that goes with it. And he's telling me about the YouTube videos he watches at home. And because he's very interested in what is happening in other countries in the world, he regularly watches videos about people going to countries where there is war. And these people then ask the people living there questions. And in my mind, I immediately go to journalists, reporters, they are doing an interview, all these types of terms, but he does not use them. But in my mind, what he is describing is news. So it's like, how interesting that you find these types of news videos interesting. And he is so shocked when I mention the word news. He is immediately taken aback. He says, this is not news. And he juxtaposes that against the things his parents watch. So his parents watch the evening broadcast. That is news. That is also very boring. These videos are actually interesting. So children's news perceptions of what they think is news, especially at this age, is very much guided by the adults in their social context. And while children regularly talked about societal issues and political figures, they did not always describe these topics as news. When discussing what news was for children in after-school care, they mentioned the adult social actors in their lives and the news that their parents or teachers consumed. But their own engagement with current affairs, including the videos that David watches on YouTube, they describe as not news, as something different. So these traditional conceptualizations of news that we see in adult populations that very much diverge now from the conceptualizations that teens and young adults have. They kind of come back with younger children who are still very much being informed by their parents and their teachers. However, these children are also mirroring the consumption patterns of teenagers. So they are still increasingly independently using media and seeing the same type of content that maybe older teenagers and young adults would describe as news. However, for them now, if it is interesting, if it is aimed at them, it's not yet news. And this was mainly in the informal social context. And then in school, news was very much characterized by what teachers found that news was. So teachers said that news was an introduction for children to the adult world. So it was always with a sense of seriousness and always not really for them. It was for adults. And then children's news interest. Alex is playing a game on his phone when his friend comes across a video of the maltreatment of pigs posted on the Instagram account of the Dutch Broadcasting Foundation, NOS. And as they watch the video together, the boys engage quickly in a conversation about the events depicted in the video. Alex urges his friend, who sits next to him, to share the video in the WhatsApp group chat that they have with their classmates. And they quickly receive a response from one of their classmates that the classmate thinks is funny, but Alex and his friend immediately discuss this response and disapprove of the reaction in the WhatsApp group. They are disgusted by it. They're disgusted by the events in the video, but they're also disgusted by the response that their peers sense. And I found this also so interesting. This was one of the first observations that I did where this happened. I was like, what is happening here? They are currently talking about news. It was a very traditional source, but on Instagram, and they're sharing it. They're forming opinions. They're forming moral objections about both the things that are happening to the animals, but also about the way that we're responding and interacting with that. So I found that very interesting too. And we saw big differences. So in this case, they kind of stumbled upon this video through their social media use. It was very much incidental. And that played a very important role in children's news engagement in the informal social context. So children's news interests in the after-school care very much reflected the playful nature of the location and consisted often of funny videos about current affairs and societal issues, but also about jokes that included political figures that they did not describe as news. This playful nature was integrated into their news interest and the content that was embedded in their everyday media use. Children were interested in current affairs, but in current affairs that were closely related to their own interests. So mirroring findings from other studies, we saw that children were very much interested in news about celebrities, but also about animal welfare, about these topics that were closely aligned with what they already liked. So these news interests mainly included soft news. Videos posted on websites of the Jeugdjournaal, which is a news broadcast for children between the ages of 8 and 12. They very much liked that, but especially when they revolved around topics that the children already found interesting. And they like to participate in discussions surrounding these videos. Very little children actually watched those videos at home, but the Jeugdjournaal played a big role in news lessons at schools. So in the break, as kind of an entertainment thing, but still making it educational, teachers very often showed this, and children were required to listen silently. But you see that they're already trying to engage with this type of content in a more playful way. Another type of content that they found interesting was the videos that linked to educational methods, where they could discuss it with each other. However, as soon as it turned into assignments, very structured, very formal, they lost interest and very quickly described news as boring. So in the informal social context, just to kind of recap a little bit, children mainly liked funny news that already related to their interests and more informal news sources. while the formal social context, there was much interest in watching the jeugdjournaal, discussing news with other children, playful, informal videos shown by teachers, and also news that already related to children's interest. And then finally, their news-related practices. I don't have an excerpt here, but I want to tell a little joke that they taught me too. And if you you can put on your microphone if you want to, we can make it a little active thing, because it's kind of like a little riddle. So they asked me, do you know who lives in the blue house? Does anyone know here? No, it's the blue man. The blue man lives in the blue house. Who lives in the red house?
The red man.
Yes, yes, indeed. And who lives in the yellow house?
The yellow man.
Yeah, and who lives in the White House?
Ah.
Biden.
Yes, you saw it coming. Well done. I didn't see it coming at the time, so I thought it was very funny when they told me. But this was such a good example of the playful ways where they introduced a political figure all of a sudden, and I was so surprised. And it didn't stop at this joke, because the moment that they mentioned Biden, they were very excited to talk about US presidents and about US politics. And they recently had elections, so they had heard about all these different types of things in the school. So it led to quite a serious conversation that included the Black Lives Matter movement, immigration from Mexico to the US, very heavy topics, and then also very quickly switched back to other jokes. So that was a very nice, playful way, but also very much demonstrated that children did enact in acts of citizenship in their own way by discussing these very pertinent and important topics, but using playful ways to kind of introduce it, and it being very unexpected. So in the informal context, these practices were mainly across kind of three different levels. Incidental news encounters, which I just mentioned, so scrolling on social media and then suddenly seeing some information that described current affairs of or something different, some political information, but also very playful engagement with news, incorporating news in play. So this Ukrainian flag, two of my participants made in Minecraft. They made a fort to protect Ukraine and found the wool, found sheep first, and then made wool and then dyed the wool blue and yellow to make the flag of Ukraine. But also through different types of memes. So I have London, Londoff, Putin, put out. These types of memes were very much reiterated. And finally, also through very intent child-led explorations of news. So the case where they had the iPad and they investigated the surroundings of Ukraine was very much quite serious, but very much inspired by their own interests. In schools, that was quite different. So it consisted of more structured activities, which is very typical, of course, as the focus was education. And these activities mainly involved answering questions and maintaining this overall sense of seriousness. But while most teachers found it quite important to cover news in class, they also felt that there was very little time to do so. The schedule was already very full, and news, especially news that aligned with children's interest, was very much at the bottom of the list of things to be discussed in a day. So teachers often opted for to discuss news in a way that was linked with educational goals, and that included the educational method nieuwsbegrip. It was children had to do assignments where they read a newspaper article and a news article and then answered questions. However, these questions were all very much focused on vocabulary and reading comprehension and not as much on news. So I think a very telling example was when the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria happened, and they had to read the text about it. And one of the questions was why it was so difficult for aid workers to get to Syria and help the people there. And the answer in the text was that the weather conditions were so bad that it was really difficult for people to get through this bad weather. And one of the boys in this group said to the other peers that he had just discussed this with his dad, and that his dad told him that there's also a war that has been going on for like a couple of years, which makes it very difficult for aid workers to get to Syria. And he really wanted to write that too, and he wanted to discuss that. And the peers in his group, they already say like, no, don't write that down. It's not in the text, so we cannot give that as an answer. And the boy's so frustrated because he knows this. He discussed it with his dad and he thought it was important to say. So he asks the teacher, and the teacher comes over and she listens to his arguments, but eventually says, she asks him, what are we doing at the moment? Are we doing something with news, or are we working on reading comprehension? Like, you only have to mention what is mentioned in the text. Do not come up with any other information. And the boy was so sad. And I thought that was such a telling example, because children would like to discuss this, but there's very limited time as well. And even the teachers would like to discuss it, but they don't have the time and resources. Other examples, again, through the Jeugdjournaal, so watching this children's news broadcast, but children had to be very quiet. They could not discuss it with each other, and structured conversations, which allowed for a bit more space to hear these different opinions and also form different opinions and practice with that. Summarizing these news-related practices in informal context, it was mainly discussing it, that the things that encountered on social media, so very much incidental, incorporating news in digital play, but also in offline play, playful discussions and jokes, as we heard, and also child-led explorations of news. While in the formal social context, it was structured. There were some playful discussions, but mainly during Jeugdjournaal, top-down assignments that incorporate news but are not focused on news, and responding to news videos. I'm already at the conclusion. I hope that throughout this presentation, I have demonstrated this kind of disconnect between these two spaces, but this disconnect in news-related practices, but also in news interests and news perception, holds several consequences, especially when it comes to children's citizenship. So, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yes, through playful news-related practices, such as joking about political figures, including news and digital play, and watching parody videos, children felt free to express their opinions, form moral judgments, inform each other about current events, but also reprimand peers for inappropriate responses and process their emotions, and ultimately explore the world around them. However, these following the conceptualizations of news as always having to be very serious or part of the adult world, playful acts of citizenship are not necessarily recognized as important or parts of developing citizenship in formal learning contexts. And this leaves little room for children's agency in enacting acts of citizenship in these spaces. While children does have limited space to do this, teachers and children are also confronted with educational systems in which there is already very limited room to incorporate news, and consequently also possibilities for civic talk with each other. Schools' conceptualizations of news further reinforce the perception among both adults and children themselves that the content that children engage with, so maybe the funny videos that they see or the jokes that they see and tell and the discussions that they have, that this is not real news. And for children, this could also lead to negative perceptions about their own citizenship, on the one hand. But on the other hand, this can also be understood as children taking ownership over their own news-related practices by distinguishing their own practices that are fun, playful, interesting from the practices of their parents and teachers, which are boring. The second consequence that it has is related to this civic talk. Our findings show that children actively seek information and employ news-related practices frequently in the context of after-school care to discuss current events and affairs with other children. And through these discussions, children expose themselves to diverse perspectives and new information. They were able to form opinions and explore societal norms and values, all activities that are found to be positively related to outcomes of news literacy, but also of political socialization. And children engaged in this civic talk in informal as well as informal context. However, while teachers try to encourage civic talk in structured conversations, they were confronted in these systems where they just had very little time. And then last but not least, what does this mean? Following these findings and our discussions, I think the overarching argument that we're making is that children's news-related practices should be understood as something beyond their introduction into the adult world. Instead, parents, childcare workers, and teachers need to consider children's own ideas, emotions, and questions that arise after engaging with news, but also with other types of information that confronts children what is happening around them in the world, but also through which they explore the world around them themselves. Children's agentive and playful explorations of news and their news-related practices can be supported by incorporating teaching strategies, for example, through which teachers take on different roles in support of playful learning. So I have now not the idea that we should move away from this very structured formal education, but I also think that there could be a role of play in teachers supporting children's development of citizenship. So while formal social contexts are less likely to incorporate moments of free play in class, teachers can support playful learning by taking on different roles of like stage manager or co-player in activities that include guided play or co-opted play, in which teachers still have this role. Examples, for example, it could include acknowledging children's contributions to conversations about news, but also playful renditions of TV broadcasts, letting them explore how news is produced, but also these discussions about the topics that they find interesting themselves. So throughout these things, we argue that play is a crucial aspect of the continuous learning process of citizenship, and that when trying to understand children's explorations, we should be mindful of these processes that they are already engaging with in and the contact they are constantly seeing and practicing with. And we show this need for pedagogical approaches that bridge this disconnect. Hi, Anna. Thank you so much. This was also the end of my presentation. If you want to know more, I am very open for all types of questions. Please send an email, add me on LinkedIn or Twitter or any of the other social platforms. But also shoot any questions, comments you have now. And I'm really looking forward to hear them. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Denise, and congratulations for your work. It's a very interesting project. I would like to open it to our audience. Does anyone have any question? Lucia, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much for your presentation. It's really amazing. I hope your PhD thesis actually, I'm quite sure by your presentation that your PhD thesis is going to be amazing. I'm looking forward to read it. I have one question and one recommendation. So about the question, the Netherlands has a very robust policy framework for digital and media literacy. And taking into consideration the participation of many organizations and even entity that is directly supported by the Ministry of Education in the country, which is the Netwerk. I'm sorry, I can't speak Dutch.
Netwerk Mediawijsheid. Yes.
And they have a very large sum of funding as well. And there's another organization which has been very important in this matter, that is Sound and Vision, and so they also have been able to train teachers on the ground. Also, there's other organizations that have been responsible for every year or every new update to train teachers on the ground, and the so-called media codes. And so also taking into consideration that the Netherlands is the 80th in the ranking of media information literacy. So it's quite high, and in Europe it's quite high, make part of the cluster too. So what my question is, are you taking into consideration that you are not talking about children or parents or education system that is floating, that is there is a very robust and very solid base where you're coming from. So I would ask you how you taking into consideration this context and how you addressing those these frameworks that are already available and the reality in the country. So that would be my question. And the recommendation now, if you allow me, is just
yes,
really, it's just really, I would do that because, again, as a journalist myself, so the Digital News Report recently launched by the Reuters Institute has found one interesting aspect of their analysis is how people relate to the news. So they try to understand through a model in which they see the user side rather than the producers. So how the users see those necessities while connecting with the news are satisfied or not. So first of all, know what is going on in the world, try to understand what is going on, but also feel and do, or feel or engage, and in some countries you have this fluctuation and you somehow were already addressing it through the playful. It's also about being able to engage, to feel, and so there is a lot of theory around and a lot of materials and studies around affective journalism, or how journalism somehow makes people feel or makes people engage. So things like positive news, so those are interesting aspects of journalism evolution as well towards understanding better and engaging better with users. That could be helpful for you also to make this correlation, because there is a movement in journalism itself towards this, and to make it news that engage, news that talks with the different audiences, and then you somehow are already giving the answer how to do that. So with a specific young people, but still it's a very important one, and actually is the main concern of journalists now, that how to engage young people. So you have, it's just an idea. Maybe you could develop that in a paper or something like that. So that's pretty much it. I talked too much. Thank you.
No, definitely not. I think that's such a wonderful, I haven't thought about the linking the concept of effective journalism indeed, but it would be very fitting, especially because you truly see that coming back, that children find something really important. They have this emotional response to it too, that leads them to also enact this citizenship process. So I think that would be really good idea for another paper too, that I can definitely work out. And I wrote it down. Then back to your question. Yes, I think there is a very robust and solid base in the Netherlands. However, it is quite difficult yet to get it off the ground in the different schools. So right now I'm focusing on these 5 different schools in Groningen, and it's also different because it's not as much in the Randstad, as we say, so not near the big cities of Amsterdam and Utrecht. So we see that, for example, the Week van de Mediawijsheid, so the Week of Media Literacy, organized by Netwerk Mediawijsheid, they have this serious game where they discuss fake news and misinformation, and they compete against each other, the schools. In that week, it is very high. Conversations about news, conversations about information, very high. Teachers are actively engaged. But the other weeks, there is no basis yet, and teachers have to come up with everything themselves. Right now, currently, there are concept goals in terms of digital literacy that are being worked out at the moment, and they'll be sent to the government to make it an official part of the curriculum as well. And maybe after that, we'll have some methods that teachers do not have to develop fully themselves, and which they can use, because I think that might also help to, because it takes a lot of time to prepare these conversations and to keep the rest in the class as well, and yeah, to get children, after having such a very eventful and interesting conversation, back to math. And I think for now, teachers struggled with that, and it took too much time still. But yes, indeed, we are very lucky to have institutions like Beeld en Geluid and Netwerk Mediawijsheid to be, yes, NGOs here and work on this. They're doing very important work. Thank you so much. I hope that answered your question, though. Okay.
Does anyone have more questions or comments?
I would like
Yes. Go ahead, Marcia.
to make a comment, if possible.
Yes.
So I clearly can I? Okay, so I clearly heard your speech and found it a very unusual topic. I am a student in communication sciences, and I have a kind of thought and reflection about this, and I want to discuss with you. So I think children have their own way to understand the world, and more specifically news. And more and more we see news about natural disasters, wars, specifically, sorry, I'm a little nervous. Specifically, news, negative things, negative news. And we also know that children have this way to ask parents. In other words, they have a tool that is asking about anything. So my question is, do you think that education is doing well? It is taking the right path about this topic, and how I know that maybe it can be easy for adults to not explain or avoid this kind of content, as well as for the children's. They mostly think it's boring, and I think a little bit of myself when I was younger. I totally thought that was a little bit boring, and that was mostly for adult things. And so how can we, as students, as young people, can like I don't know, can turn the news a more interesting topic for them, and like you said, they mostly watch YouTube content and other digital platforms. So yeah, and congratulations for your speech.
Thank you so much. No need to be nervous because I am also still a student, so
I know it's like my second webinar, and I didn't do this very much, but
no, it's like all good to you. Very good for asking a question and also very good questions. I think especially teachers in education, they are doing their best. They are giving it their all. And I think they're working very hard on promoting this and thinking about ways to talk about news with children, which is very difficult because we're constantly trying to find this balance between educating and also parenting and raising. And so we have this view of, okay, parenting and raising should be in the home, but children also spend 8 hours a day in school. What is the role of teachers in that way? Can teachers decide if they want to discuss these very heavy, maybe even a bit scary topics with children? So those are very scary topics also for teachers. They don't want to have angry parents knocking at the doors. So this is also why the youth news broadcast was used so often. It's been around for 40 years already in the Netherlands. So it's been long running. So the teachers often grew up themselves, or their kids grew up with the news broadcast, and they know that people know it and the topics there are kind of fine. So it's an easy way to not having to make that discussion or not having to engage in that discussion or make that decision. So I think in that regard, they are doing very well. I think even the youth news broadcast is doing very well because they present both very adult topics, but from a child's perspective, as well as more informal, soft news topics that align with children's interests. I think the disconnect we are seeing now is that during such a broadcast in these structured environments, children have to be quiet. They have to treat it with respect and seriousness. They cannot make jokes. They cannot talk with each other about it. And I very much see where that is coming from. But we are also seeing that that limits their possibilities of engaging as citizens and developing as citizens. However, I'm not an educational specialist, so I also don't have full answers on how to do this because we are confronted with a lot of different things that we have to talk about in schools throughout the days. But yes, I see that like this disconnect is what we located. I hope that answers your question. I think your Wi-Fi might be a bit shaky.
Thank you, Denise. I don't know if Marcia listened you. She's freeze.
Oh yeah, I think she's gone now too.
Yeah. We are on time, but if anyone have a last question or comment, Mariana.
Good night. Congratulations, Denise.
Thank you.
It's just like I'm very curious about the different neighborhoods that you explored, and maybe can you speak a little bit more if in your findings you found something that is interesting regarding this social difference between the neighborhoods?
Yes, yes, definitely. So the after school care locations were also linked to the schools. So the children who would go to one school in that neighborhood would also go to the after school care location in that neighborhood if they were going. And you also see that these different schools had different pedagogical approaches. So in the mixed socioeconomic neighborhood, we went to a school where it was a Dalton school. So it's typically focused more on social, emotional development, but also about children's development of their own, yes, their own interests, and it's very interesting to see. So in that ways, there was more time to respond to emotions, to talk about that. They started with this little round of how everyone was feeling, and sometimes news also came up there. So that was a very big difference to other locations. And then in the neighborhood with a high socioeconomic status, the school was an international private school. It was more competitive, I feel. Children there had an assignment where they needed to bring a newspaper article in class, read it, present it, and come up with questions about it to their peers. So it was I think, a very challenging assignment, actually, which also stood out in the approaches. And there was like very heart-to-heart discussions there in class. Like children were very vocal. And then in other locations, especially the location in the lower socioeconomic neighborhood, we know from other research that lower socioeconomic status is related to having less news-rich homes as well. However, in the schools, we saw that children were still actively discussing it, still enjoying discussing those topics, but they were less prevalent and less informed beforehand. But the teacher at that location found it very important himself. So it's also very much dependent on what the teacher finds important to spend time on as well. So that's the kind of differences I saw in terms of news at the locations. However, these playful conversations happened across all 4 neighborhoods, which I found really interesting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Denise, I want to
Yes.
make a small question before ending, if no one wants to come forward, at least. But following the question that Mariana made you and what you were saying, do you found also differences, for instance, in the topics of interest? Were they selected by adults or were they in any case brought by children?
Yes. Well, that did not differ based on the neighborhoods, I feel, but it differed very much on the context they were in. So if they were in this playful context of the after-school care, it was the things that they were interested in. And if the topic of news only was addressed a little bit, they had very narrower expectations of news and the topics that they then talked about. You see that those were also topics that their parents had talked to them about before, or that they had heard in the car with their parents. So you mainly saw a difference between locations within a neighborhood then.
Mm-hmm. What I notice in my research is that sometimes parents talk about how topics of news affect children. They don't sleep, or they ask many questions, or they are scared. Do you notice also that?
I did not.
Kind of concern?
Sorry?
That kind of concern of
Yes,
them.
the concern very much with the childcare workers and the teachers, not as much at the children themselves. I did not, in the data, there is no instance where they talked about it negatively, or if that they were scared or explained such concerns. But yes, indeed. So at 3 of the 4, that's a good one to tell actually. 3 of the 4 after-school care locations, the childcare workers said that news was not a topic that children were discussing or were interested in, and that they were also not talking about news themselves. And I started focusing on this when I heard these kids talking about the war in Ukraine, because that was very much something that they were also worried about. And at these locations where the childcare workers said, like, no, we don't discuss it, I constantly heard the kids talking about it. It's like, but they are discussing it with each other. You are not discussing it. And I get that, because it is for them very difficult to know which children to incorporate in that. In one of the 4 locations, which was in a mixed neighborhood, the childcare worker said, the children come up to me with questions. I feel that it's important to answer their questions, but he was also very much talking to the parents and knowing which children to involve in those conversations, and enacting in those conversations when kids who might be a bit more afraid or a bit more worried about these topics were playing outside, upstairs, in some other space, and they were then not necessarily involved in that conversation. But it was indeed something that both childcare workers and teachers very much thought about.
Thank you very much for your lovely presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. This is such a wonderful environment. I already said this also to Margarida, that I feel like I always have these nice people in Portugal who support me in my research. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you once again, Denise. We are on time, but we have just 1 more minute to invite you to watch previous webinars on our playlist and check out our website. We are constantly every week updated with the next webinars, reports, and other information about young people relations with news. And also, of course, invite you to subscribe our newsletter. I put all the links here in the chat. So thank you so much, Denise, and all the people that came to listen. And see you in the next webinar.
In Ljubljana. I think we will see in Ljubljana the next
First in
stop.
Ljubljana, and after this in the digital webinar.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Have a nice week.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you.